Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Stratus Quilt Sew Along. If you missed week 1 or want to go back and watch it, I'll go ahead and put a link right up here for you to be able to go and find that video. So today we're at week 2 and I am so excited to start cutting into our fabrics for our Stratus quilts. But before I begin, let's do a quick overview of the schedule. Week 1 was last week. That was for picking out our fabrics. We covered a lot in that video about how to pick out your fabrics, different fabric combinations you could use, even prizes for the sew along. So if you want to find that, check it out. I also have a lot of information about the sew along in a blog post on my website, which we'll link in the description. So that was week 1. We're now on week 2 where we are prepping our fabrics and cutting them out. And then week 3 will be next week where we make our wonky strip blocks. And then week 4 we'll put all the blocks together into our quilt top. So I'm very excited to have you here with me, whether you're doing it along with me or finding these videos later on. I hope that you find these videos helpful as you make your Stratus quilt. So if you watched last week's video, you know I was having a hard time choosing between 2 different fabric bundles, and I've decided to go with these orange and yellow fabrics, mostly because it's fall and I wanted it to feel more like fall. So we've got some fun burned orange all the way through, like a little bit of coral in here and then to yellow. And I'm going to do these in an ombre layout. But if you were doing one, you could do it with ombre or without ombre. Either way works perfectly. And then I'm using this like almost off-white color called rice paper from PBS as my sashing and borders. So I have all my fabrics picked out, but let's cover some of the other supplies that you'll see me using throughout this video for week 2. First off, my ironing board right here, and then also a nice hot iron. This is a Reliable Velocity 230 IR, and it's the one that I use, and it's also one of the prizes for the sew along. So really excited to have that as a prize. It's a wonderful iron, and you'll see me using it on here and then also in other tutorials. In addition to that, I use Best Press in a misting spray bottle. I use the unscented Best Press and I love having it mist, but I have heard from some people that Best Press sometimes causes them to cough. So if that is the case for you, consider watering it down, consider using a non-misting spray bottle. Those both might help with any sort of coughing issues that you have, or just use plain water. That's fine too. Or no spray at all, or steam in your iron. The possibilities are endless. I just share what I like to do, and maybe you'll like it too. So that's what we need for pressing to get our fabrics nice and crisp and ready to cut. And then once we start cutting, I have my rotary cutter with a nice fresh blade. I literally just changed out the blade on this, so I'm really excited about that. Some rulers. I'm going to use a ruler like this, as well as I shared this last week, but I'm going to use my Stripology Ruler for cutting out the sashing and borders. So I've got mine nice and handy right here. And then of course the quilt pattern. So if you have your quilt pattern, make sure you get it handy so that you can reference it while we're cutting. If you don't have the quilt pattern yet, check out the description below for a link to get it as a PDF download from my shop, and you can get it today. So that's the best route to go if you want the Stratus pattern to sew along with me. I do also have paper patterns available in my shop, but it will take a few days to get it to you because I mail them from my home here in Florida. Alright, now that we've covered the supplies that we'll be using for week 2, I'm going to go ahead and heat up my iron and start prepping my fabrics. I've got my iron nice and hot. I actually use the turbo setting pretty much all the time because I like it hot. I don't have water in my iron, so the steam is turned off, and I'll just use my Best Press in my spray bottle. And we'll just go ahead and grab the first fat quarter. I'm using a series of fat quarters for my quilt, but you can use whatever you have picked out, that's fine. But I'll just go ahead and lay it out flat, and you'll see there are lots of creases in it from it being folded. So I'll take my Best Press and spritz all over. Alright, it doesn't have to be soaking wet, but it helps if it's a little damp. And then what I do is I fold it over and press it down, just in case that liquid kind of doesn't soak into the fabric. letting it soak in with pressure always helps. So now we're ready to start ironing. And you'll notice a lot of those creases already kind of went away just with the water. So the iron really just dries the fabric. Once that first piece of fabric is done, I actually like to keep it on the ironing board and then just grab my next piece and lay it right on top. That way any of the best press that sprays through can kind of soak into the piece underneath it and just give it some extra love. You'll go ahead and repeat that process for all of your fabrics that you're going to be doing with your Wonky strips. And then I also prep the background fabric as well. So if you have your fabric for your borders and your sashing, you can also do that too. It's more important for the fabrics that are going to be Wonky strips because we are going to be sewing those on like weird angles. So they're kind of going to be a little bit more stretchy. Where the sashing and the borders we're cutting on grain, so it's less of an issue with stretching. But I personally like to prep all my fabrics the same way. So finish pressing all of your fabrics and then we'll be ready to start cutting. Now that all of my fabrics are pressed, I'm ready to start my favorite part of the quilt process, and that is cutting these Wonky strips. So in order to do that, you can actually layer a couple of your fabric pieces on top of each other and cut like 3 or 4 layers at once. That works really well if you're doing the scrappy scattered version because it already kind of scatters them up a bit. However, I'm doing the ombre, so I'm only going to cut 1 layer at a time just so that I can keep my strips like color coordinated because we're going to want to lay them out from one end of the spectrum to the other. So I will start off by just grabbing one of my pieces of fabric, and then this is where the pattern comes in handy. If you have the pattern, there are diagrams in the pattern that show you how to cut the Wonky strips, whether you're doing a fat quarter or a 1/3 yard cut, because you'll get more strips out of it if you cut it a certain way. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to cut my fat quarter. Now, one really fun thing about Wonky strips is that you don't have to use a ruler if you don't want to. I personally am using a ruler because it's just easier for me and I don't like the feeling of freehanding it. However, some people really enjoy it. So if you like the sensation of just hacking at it and not measuring and not using a ruler, and your lines are fairly straight when you're cutting freehanded, feel free to do that. It's not going to mess up anything unless they're like really curvy, but I'm going to use a ruler for mine. Alright, so you'll see I've got my pieces of fabric ready. I'm going to trim off the end here just to get them even so that they're not curved and fraying, and then rotate the fabric. And then follow the instructions in the pattern for how big your strips need to be. And then just kind of have fun with it, with the sizing of each strip and the angles. This part is supposed to be fun, so let's keep it fun. I also want to mention that if you are doing ombre like I am, the first color and the last color, so maybe your lightest and your darkest, or like whichever ones are going to be in the corners, you need half as many strips of those as you need of the other colors. So feel free to keep that in mind as you're cutting. You might be able to save some fabric that way. Or what you could do is cut the same number of strips of each piece, and then at the end make a mini quilt with the leftovers that you have of the lightest and the darkest, and just alternate those two. That would be a really fun way to use up the scraps from this scrap buster quilt. Once you've cut up all of your strips for one color, go ahead and layer them on top of each other so that we can keep them nice and organized. And then we'll repeat the process for the rest of your colors. Once you have all of your Wonky strips cut, it'll look something like this. If you're doing ombre, I just want to reiterate, you want to keep your colors organized. That'll be the easiest for you later on. So I keep all of one color all next to each other, stack them up, and then set these aside so that we can get to them next week. If you are doing the scrappy scattered version, you can go ahead and mix them all up now as you're stacking them, or you can do that as you're sitting at your sewing machine next week. You can just kind of pick and choose as we're sewing. So we have our wonky strips cut out for our wonky blocks, but the next portion of cutting is cutting out the sashing and the borders. So go ahead and grab your fabric for that. I'm using this large piece of off-white. And you can cut it normally just with your rotary cutter and your ruler and moving it every couple of inches. Just follow the instructions in the pattern for how many strips to cut for the size that you're making. I am going to do a quick little demo on how I use my Stripology Ruler to cut the strips. Another helpful tool might be AccuQuilt. If you have an AccuQuilt and the right size strip die, you're more than welcome to use that as well. Use whatever works best for you. So I'm going to show you how to use the Stripology Ruler, but first things first, I have to get my fabric ready for it. So you'll notice the fabric comes off the bolt, and it's a 42-inch piece of fabric, but it's folded. So keep that initial fold, and we're going to fold it in half one more time. So it'll be 4 layers of fabric here. But we've got it folded technically twice, but we're only folding it once. And spread it out over your cutting mat. And I'm gonna readjust my camera angle real quick and grab my ruler. Okay, I'm hoping that this is a good angle. I'll go ahead and put my ruler up here for you. You'll see that this ruler is quite large and has all of these slots in between every ½ inch, which is what makes this ruler so amazing. It has a little grippy surface in between each slot, which is nice. It helps keep the fabric intact, like in place. And then we go ahead and we want to make sure that our fabric is positioned between the slots. So like there's a way to get your ruler in and out at each end. We want our fabric in between those 2 areas. And then there are tons of lines across that we can line our fabric up to make sure that it is on grain. And we're going to line up the 0 line as close to the edge of the fabric as possible, but we're not going to line it up directly on it. We are going to cut off a little excess to get it on a straight line. So go ahead and hold your ruler in place and just cut on 0. And then without picking up or moving the ruler, we're going to cut as many strips as we can across. One really neat thing about the Stripology Ruler is it's numbered along the bottom, and then it also has stars for every 1.5 inches or squares for every 2.5 inches. And I know some people even use little stickers to put where they need to cut. So if you wanted to use stickers for this, you totally could. A quick little safety tip. I find that holding it near where you're cutting is helpful, but you always want to make sure that you're not accidentally putting your finger in line with where your rotary blade will go. So try to keep it 1 inch or so away, because we definitely could get injured fairly easy with that. Once you get to the end, you'll go ahead and remove your ruler. And you'll see we have all of our strips nice and cut out. We can go ahead and stack them on top of each other. So you'll do that for all of your with the fabric strips. And then there's one really neat thing I want to show you too for these smaller sashing pieces that I'll show you an example for right now. So you want to use your Stripology to cut out your other sashing pieces as well. You totally can. Just go ahead and line your strips up. I'm going to put the selvage edge together, and you can do more than just 2 strips at one time, but I was just going to go and show you an example. So I've got my 2 strips of fabric right like this, and then go ahead and place your ruler on top. and line it up so that your fabric is in line with one of the horizontal lines on your ruler. And then inch it over to where the 0 is right where you want to cut off, and then go ahead and cut on the 0. And now we're going to cut all of our individual sashing pieces. So when you remove the ruler, you can see all of our sashing is so easily cut like that. So I find the Stripology a really great way to save time while you're cutting. Okay friends, now we're done cutting out our strips using the Stripology ruler and our sashing as well as our wonky strips. So I'm dying to know, which portion did you like better? The wonky strips cutting just free, or did you like using the Stripology or another method to cut out your sashing and borders? Let me know in the comments below. And also, if you have any questions about this week's video or progress for the sew along, be sure to leave a comment and I'll try to answer that for you. Now that we're done cutting, be sure to take a picture of your progress and post it on Instagram with hashtag Stratus, SAL, that stands for Stratus Sew Along, to be entered to win prizes for this week of the sew along. Thanks so much for joining me. Happy sewing.